Alright, there's the engraving on the boarding axe. You're going to see how I did the cleanup and engraving on this axe. Hi, Dan Tokar here at the Willow Forge in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. This is a copy of a late 18th, early 19th century boarding axe that I made using traditional materials and techniques. This is made out of wrought iron with steel inserts in the blade and in the bill. Wrought iron, the ears are welded on, forge welded on, and the engraving was done in a traditional manner. It's a nice piece of hickory that I split out myself and turned. The ball is actually all of one piece with the rest of the handle. That's not an applied ball. That's a ball that was turned from the total piece. This is a presentation piece for a member of the crew of the Luna, a ship on the Chesapeake Bay. So, I might as well give you a closer look at this thing. The pitch is a traditional way of covering the end grain on these things. The engraving is that late 18th, early 19th style naive engraving. The eagle stamp is a little hard to see, but that's a federal eagle. Try and get you a view of all of the different aspects of how this thing goes together. But anyway, this is about 23 hours of work to make this axe to this point. It actually took longer to do the cleanup than to actually weld together and forge out the axe. Even the handle is a couple of hours of work to turn that out with the correct tapers, because this is based on an original existing example. Got a nice feel. Boarding axes are a different thing. I'm not an expert on the history of boarding axes, but I do know that they were used for damage control on fighting sailing ships, because you had to cut away the burning rigging and sails and clear the deck, so they were meant for chopping ropes and canvas and spars, and you'd use the hook to drag things to drop them overboard to get burning debris off the deck. You could also chop out red-hot cannonballs, hot shot, and then use the beak to pry the cannonball out. They say too that as a real boarding axe, the real purpose was not necessarily as a weapon, but you were supposed to go over and cut the ropes, the lines and rigging that allowed the ship to be steered. So you'd go for chopping out the steering cables. And if you can't steer, you can't fight the ship. If you're wondering what that rumbling sound in the background is, I've had a train sitting on the siding for about an hour now. It's huffing and puffing away. You probably can hear it. But anyway, sad to say that I did not think to make any video of actually forging out the head on this thing. So what mostly is to follow is the cleanup and the engraving and setting the rivets and mounting this thing on the handle. And that should be entertaining enough for a while. And I have to make more of these, so at some point I'll probably post a video of welding this whole thing together and showing you how these ears, these langettes, get welded on. Because forge welding stuff like this is it's not necessarily a delicate operation, but they do have to go on in the right place. You can't just put them anywhere. It's quite an operation. Late 18th, early 19th century pattern. Not one of the official government patterns, but something you might have seen on a privateer. It is. This is the boarding axe as forged and hardened and tempered. I'm going to have to strip off the scale, but all I've done at this point is washed it to get some of the forge junk off. And just to give you an idea of what this thing looks like currently, that's all forge welded. With a steel bit, a steel piece sandwiched in the inside. So there is steel in the blade and steel in the hook. And the ears are welded on. That's all forge welding. I've got my angle grinder, my goggles, and my earmuffs on. Turn it over. Okay, that's the boarding axe after it's been wire brushed. Still has that sort of pear skin look to it. Oh, and there you can see the eagle. It's one of the stamps I use on early axes. Okay, so there's the axe sitting in a plastic tub. I add some water. You always add the acid to the water, not the water to the acid. And this is some old acid. That I've used for etching steel before. Let's see here. Like this. And you can see it reacting a little bit. And I'll have it in the acid for maybe 10 minutes, which is enough to get more or less all of the scale off without really etching it. You can see a little bubbling going on. It's reacting nicely, but not so ferociously that it looks like it's boiling. So this is the boarding axe after it's been pickled. Didn't take long, and you can see most of the scale is off. There is that sort of pear skin you get when you use acid to take forged scale off. There's a bit more forged scale on the ears, and I also discover the end of a scarf for the forge weld for the ears. That's what that little line right there is, but that will probably file out. It's just a very little tab. There's nothing on that side. And again, you can see the lead out for where the ears were welded on. But yeah, that's pretty good. More importantly, it's stuck together and it's straight. First go around, I'm going to use a very worn out bastard file, a very coarse file, and just take off the little bits of scale that still exist. The whole reason you take the scale off is because it's harder than a file, so it'll wear out your files. So when you're doing this rough stuff, you can use an old worn out file and use it just to take off those little bits of scale that didn't come out with the acid. Nothing too serious about shaping or anything, just removing scale. Okay. This is what you use your files for just before they become stock to forge something out of, because this stuff is so abrasive, scale, that it will just chew a good file to pieces. I've got enough of a wiggle in this ear that what I might end up doing is hammering on this cold a little bit just to straighten it out a little bit. I wasn't taking particular care to keep those things straight when I was forging, because they're just soft metal. They don't harden, so they're easy enough to get turned around. All I'm doing is taking scale off. Same thing with right in there. That's just I will occasionally use sharpening stones, hand stones. This is just a very coarse man-made carborundum stone just to get the scale up quickly. A little bit there too. Okay, I'm going to go wash this off in some clean water. Okay, so I've got a mandrel that fits the taper of this thing, and all I'm doing is taking some of the little wiggles out of the langettes, the ears on the side of this thing. It's much easier to Whitesmith to file once it's even, and they're thin enough that I can hammer them cold over this mandrel. Alright, get a little bit of correction. So after refining that shape on the mandrel a little bit, I'm going to take a better bastard file and start going over the ears. I might need to use a little hammer there, just tap it up on the taper. What I want to do is end up with a nice smooth surface. So the first thing I have to do is file down the little forging scars, because no matter how clean you are at forging, you will always have tiny little hammer marks. But fortunately, in this soft material that makes up the body of this axe, it's really not very difficult to file out and correct the contour. Now there are some people who would just attack this with an angle grinder to do this, and that's perfectly fine. It's just that I get a lot more control with my file, and I don't have to have all that noise, and it is the traditional method. And since this is a very traditional boarding axe, I am just going to go ahead and do it the way I want to. Sometimes that's all it comes down to, is you just want to do something a particular way, and that's fine too. What I'm trying to do in this procedure is just level and refine the basic shape, get past all of the major forging dings, the tiny little pits that you inevitably get no matter how careful you are. I change directions every now and then because you will be amazed how easy it is to start filing out of true just because your body has its own preferences. So I change directions, and this helps me keep things true. With this kind of whitesmithing process, you're really going through it just like you would if you were sanding. The coarse bastard cut files are just to remove a lot of material to achieve a plane, a flat surface, or a true surface, because like right now, this is not flat per se, it's a curved langette. But what I'm doing is smoothing it out, taking the pits and wiggles out. And this will probably take another half hour or so, which you don't necessarily have to see. Just continuing along, I've now gone to a bastard rat tail file to do the radius, the little corner where the eye meets the blade. And clean up that radius. All right, 2 hours of filing later. And we have the basic form and fairly well cleaned up. I will go to stones or sandpaper to smooth it out a bit more before starting the engraving. But that's the basic form. The shape is right. The surfaces are fairly smooth and straight. Just a little more cleanup to even it out. The originals did not have a high bright finish, but this is supposed to be a presentation piece with a dedication, an engraving in it. So I take it like those presentation tomahawks that had a Whitesmith surface and engraving. They didn't actually polish them, they just took them to a burnished white. Now, this is the boarding axe after an afternoon of filing and stoning and sanding. It's got a nice satiny finish, still a few little forging scars here and there. But that's good enough to lay out the engraving and the rest of it. Okay, here's the layout and the clamp up to do the engraving. I've already cut the roped border, and I've got the layout for the lettering. Sometimes the camera is just in the way. Because normally what I would do is just walk around the vise, but having the camera where it is means that I've got to make some minor adjustments. I know I'm no great shakes with an engraving tool, but that kind of matches the style. A lot of 18th century engraving is what's called naive engraving. It's done by people who really were never taught how to engrave. They just kind of picked it up and did it. Like I said, the camera is just in a position where sometimes I'm just going to end up walking right into the frame because I have to keep moving with the tool. That was probably a very enlightening image of my shoulder because I had to again rotate around as I was cutting this letter E. The main thing is I'm trying to go this way across the work because there's a good chance that I will accidentally erase my layout by my hand touching it. So I want to do all the lettering sort of as a sweep along here. So I'll be doing some on each line so that I don't obscure it or accidentally wipe it and erase it. may not be easy to see, but I have a pencil layout line, and then I have a freehand layout of the letters in fine Sharpie in marker on there. And since this is relatively smooth steel, it won't erase easily if I touch it, but it's still something that I have to be careful of. And I can put the dots above the eyes in with a center punch. Why don't I do that while I'm still thinking about it? It's just a center punch. And no, I resist the temptation to put little smiley faces above my eyes. I also have to check the engraving tool every now and then to see if there's wear on the tip, because stopping and sharpening this thing is necessary. Even though this is a wrought iron and steel axe, and I'm cutting through the wrought iron right now, doing the engraving, it still wears, and you can even break the tip if you're not careful. So you do have to be aware whether you have a sharp point, because all of a sudden you can make some very ragged cuts. And you may have noticed there are no erasers on the ends of engraving tools. If I make a bad cut, it is difficult to fix it. Not impossible, but difficult. So this is why you have to be careful. You only get one chance to do this cleanly. If I keep talking like that, I'll make myself nervous. If you want to know what the font is, the letter form that I'm using for this, I call it late Tokar, because it's just my version of block lettering. I'm not really attempting on this one to do a true 18th century letter form, because this is a modern dedication for a modern piece. I am not reproducing a period piece here. So I'm not so concerned about having exactly the right letter forms. I'm trying to do something that looks like it could have been done, and there is a wide variation in font letter form in 18th century engraving, because again, they are mostly being done by gunsmiths and other people who really are not trained engravers. They pick it up from their master, and they do a fairly competent job of it, but most of them are not really engravers in any other than a practical sense. And I have to admit, I qualify under that definition. But I don't have any formal training in this other than having watched a couple of guys do it. So Any of you real engravers out there who are laughing their behinds off right now, well, that's fine. I guess I can laugh at you when I watch you forge, and you can laugh at me when you watch me engrave. That way, we're all kind of equal in this. There, I had to get in the way of the camera again to do that E. It's fairly consistent. The way the E's are tilted and the way that curl is, I really can't cut a letter E with the camera in that position without getting in the way. But we're doing pretty good. Tooling along. I really don't know whether this is interesting to you guys or not, because it's something that happens at its own pace. Like right now, I'm trying to figure out, here, I'll move the camera because I have to do the letter P, and the letter P requires that I get in here and come around, which is difficult with the camera in the way. Sometimes what I will do, I think I'll move the camera back, is chase the engraving with chasing tools after I have cut it. They're getting the full effect now. Amateur videography, amateur engraver. But try and make the letters begin and end on the layout line. Like I said, I have a little very faint pencil line, which is where I drew the layout letters. And it looks a lot neater if you can actually start and stop a letter on one of the layout lines. On a good day, I can pull this sort of stuff off cleanly enough to even fool myself a little bit. But then I will pull out one of the books and look at what good engraving looks like, and I'll put myself in my place and say, Dan, that's what good stuff looks like. This is just as I say, naive engraving. Something done by an unschooled country blacksmith. Which is as it should be for a piece like this. You at least want to have the letters starting at the same place, having the same height for their general form. Here I'm going to get a little above myself and actually put a serif on the beginning letter. Ooh. That's what those funny little spurs are on letters, serifs. Again, to do this S, I'm going to have to climb around from the opposite side. An engraving ball, an engraving vise would allow you to rotate the work I'm going to move the camera because it's really in the way for this part. The other thing that really helps is having light where you can actually see what you're doing. Yes, I think I pulled that S off. Once I've actually cut all of the letters, I will go over it with a stone to take the burrs off. I might even burnish it a little bit, but I'll show you a good shot of it before I do any of that. Sometimes those little burrs don't want to come off at the end. All right, we have another one of those pesky E's. Right. So I should go up here and do that E. Okay. Almost done. I have 3 letters left, and of course one of them is a letter that's going to require me to swing around again, so I'm going to put the camera further back so that I can actually walk around this without getting in the way of the camera. All right. Now an O. And O's are sometimes funny because you want to make them round. But you quite often have to cut them from 2 different directions. Making the 2 cuts meet up in the middle is always an exercise. That's a good word for it. It's an exercise. The other reason you want a sharp point is because on smooth metal, if the point isn't sharp, it'll actually dance around a little bit when you start to try and seat it. So you have to put enough pressure on the point so that it doesn't skitter out. Here I'll use all those technical terms. Skitter out. And I think I'll even do a couple of little serifs on this thing when I get to the end, because it is a capital. That. Here, I'm going to move the camera again. These floating camera moves, you can tell, are all mechanically done. I'm not doing this with editing software. You're just going to have to live with the fact that it's kind of the manual editing. Again, I had to have that engraved line meet up with the line that was cut from the top, which is not always an easy thing. I'm going to deepen the main line here a little bit. Put a couple of little serifs on there. I might even do that on the T. Why not? All right, now I can put my glasses back on so that I can see what I'm doing. What I'm going to do is use a little... Okay, we've got a rag with some alcohol in it, which I'll use to take out the remainder of the layout line, because Sharpie will wash off with... Oh, you get little bits of the cloth. It shows you how sharp the burrs are. So yes, I've got to go over that with a stone. And I've also got to make the roping in the border. This border here is supposed to look like a rope from the ship. So still got to do that. And as I said, occasionally you have to sharpen the engraving tool. This one, it's a little hard to see the tip on that, but it's not quite sharp right now. So I have my little Arkansas stone. I get it wet. And all I do is turn it over to the other flat. And I'm honing the entire flat of the tool here, because an engraving tool doesn't have a secondary bevel. It really is the geometry of the tool is the cutting edge. There is no secondary bevel on a cutting tool. I mean on a engraving tool. So you have to grind that entire face when you're sharpening it. And you want to keep it even so that the point stays in the center of the tool. And then you do the back. And there can be a little bit of a burr. If you feel a little bit of a burr, you can sort of strop it with your blacksmith fingers, because we're just as good as leather. And that's sharpened again. All right, I take my trusty little hammer and start to rope. So where do I start my roping? Why don't I start my roping right there? The idea here is that we want this parallel set of lines to have these sort of S-shaped ladder rungs, and that way it resembles the ley lines in a rope. It's kind of funny, but I spend almost as much time cutting the border on this thing as I do the lettering. Uh-oh, I've got a customer coming. Gotta stop. Continuing the roping on the border. The idea here is not to make absolutely perfect roping, because I'm going to go back and deepen and correct I go over the whole pattern once, and then I go back and improve the ones that need a little help. Because sometimes you have things that are a little lighter, that need to be deeper. And sometimes you have things that need to be corrected a little bit in their outline, and you can do things with chasing tools and other things to help correct those little blips. And then there's a lot that has to be done with removing burrs. Burrs can be a real pain sometimes. So all this roping around the edges can actually take longer than the inscription did. Yeah, I am no great shakes with an engraving tool, but then I remember my friend many years ago who was a storekeeper who was a hobbyist blacksmith, and all the blacksmiths used to think he was a pretty good storekeeper, and all the storekeepers thought he was a pretty good blacksmith. So I kind of feel the same way about my engraving technique. All the blacksmiths think I'm an okay engraver, and all the engravers think I'm an okay blacksmith. So it is what it is. Also, this is not a bad thing to be doing on a hot, humid day. You've gotten back into the 90-degree weather with the high humidity. I remind people that my shop is in a floodplain with a swamp behind it, or should I say a marsh. People around here will argue with you about whether that's a swamp or a marsh back there. Alright, I gotta give it a little termination here. Okay, now I've got to continue the roping on this side.
Well, if all of this gets to be a bit tedious, like watching paint dry, feel free to fast forward to the end. Ah, I have a customer coming too. If you think I get to work uninterrupted, this is Monday morning and a customer just pulled up and I'm trying to finish this last little bit before I have to talk to him. Nope, gotta go. Okay. My first customer of the day going back. He brought in an apple butter kettle to get fixed. We have an apple butter season here, and the apples come in. Awful lot of apple orchards in this area. Just about the time I get toward the end of one of these things, I start to get better at it. If I mess up the roping a bit, I can always tell them that that's where the splice in the rope was. Making the little frayed ends on the rope. Okay. Wow. Lots of little burrs everywhere. All right. What I think I'll do next is go over the inscription and make it prettier. I've also got to put a lot of the little serifs in. That would probably be a good thing to make it prettier. All right. So what I do is I take some 320 grit sandpaper, wrap it around an old file, And I'm just going to do this lightly to knock the burrs down. This will make it easier to correct things, because sometimes you read the burrs and not the actual engraving, and you've got to be able to tell the difference. Okay, I'm going to wash that off. So I'm going to reestablish my lines with my little Sharpie marker here, and that's just so I can put the serifs and correct the spacing on the letters a little bit, because it looks much neater if everything comes to the same line. It's not all higgly-piggly all over the place. We want to make it look like somebody did this on purpose, that it didn't just happen at random. All right, so that's a set of lines. Okay, I brought the camera over and changed the lighting, and you can see that I have a little bit of correcting to do. Some of the lettering is not spaced perfectly, and we have a little bit of serif and sizing work to do. All right, now that I've got my lines reestablished, I can find out where the little baseline serifs might need to go. And they're much lighter lines than the rest of the lettering. Sometimes the direction of the cut makes a big difference in where the serif ends up. These little details can really make a difference. All right, then I'm gonna go around and correct other things. Back to the roping. This little bit of rounding and deepening I'm doing makes the roping look a lot more like a rope. Okay, now the camera is actually getting in the way. I'm going to move it again. All right, back to deepening the roping. And I've got another customer coming. All right. All right. After taking the burrs off, I'm using a little bit of fine sandpaper to refine the burrs even a little bit more and also clean up the background. You gotta remember,
This is sort of me channeling my 18th century engraver. So this is not like modern engraving. It's still got a lot of dirt down in the grooves, but that will help you see it a little better. All right, I've moved the camera around. I'm going to take this thing out of my little primitive hold down. I've got a couple of C-clamps holding this thing in place, a couple of wooden blocks just to hold the, and that's the inscription. I could clean up the background a little better. Yep, that's probably as far as I want to go with this until I put the handle on it. See if I can do the mirror thing where you can actually see things. Like there's the camera. There I am waving. Anyway. All right, now we've got our axe, and what I need to do is seat it in some pitch. All these original naval boarding axes, this is a can of real pine pitch, which I'm going to warm up. I'm going to warm up the axe a little bit. Take a little brass rod and gather up a little bit. This is real pine pitch. Put a little bit inside the eye. Every original one of these things I've ever seen that still had the original haft on it had tar or pitch or something in the places that were protected. I think they did that as sort of a corrosion layer and also as bedding. Anything going on a ship back then was probably just coated in tar. I'm going to warm this up. And this will just coat the inside of the eye with a thin layer of pitch. It's kind of like roofing tar, except it's made from trees instead of oil. I just want it hot enough to coat the inside of the eye. This is one of those funny little details that most people don't bother with. But if you're going to make something as true to the originals as you can manage, if they did it, you should do it too. I don't know if you can see any of this. But basically, that pitch is melting and coating the inside of the eye, and that will seal it up so when you are on a ship for 100 years, nothing will rust or rot from the inside. I'm assuming you're going to take care of the rust and rot from the outside. All right. Okay. This is still warm enough that the pitch is kind of gooey. I've got my handle that I've already shaved down so that it has a good fit. This is a nice piece of hickory. Okay. And then I tap it with my fiber mallet. See if you can get a close-up view of the little bit of tar that's stuck in there. But you notice how the handle has a taper that matches the taper of the ears, the langettes. And there's the engraving. I've got to drill a couple holes and put some rivets in. Got a rivet set that has a nice head on it. I have a rivet sticking through the haft now, and the projection on that should be 1.5 times the diameter, and that's a 3/16 rivet that's sticking out just a little bit past 1/4 inch, so that should be about the right height. I've got a train on the siding too, so if you hear a low sort of thumping sound, I can't wait forever for the train to get off the siding. They're just sitting there chugging away. So I'll put the rivet set there. Put the head in the circular thing. I have another rivet set that just has a hole. I'm going to tap that down just to make sure I get it seated as tight as I can before I start hitting the rivet. Just want to make sure that the rivet head is actually down. Hold it in there. And you need a ball peen hammer of the right size for the rivet. If you use too big of a hammer, you'll just drive it through the work. If you use too small of a hammer, you won't really upset the head properly. And you want it to be as vertical as possible so that you don't bend the rivet before you've upset it. And I just tap it. And of course my rivet set decides to move. That's always a good thing. Tighten it up. Again, you're not trying to make the head of the rivet all in one shot, one blow here. You're kind of sneaking up on it, and you sometimes have to correct the direction on the hammer. Like I'm moving it around a little bit to direct which part gets upset. You'll see that I'm getting a nice because my set down there is moving around. Set that properly again. That might be better. And once I get it upset, I start shaping the head.
Now, I can go after this part with the ball peen part of the hammer, or I can use another rivet set to drive it down and make the head more symmetrical. So I've got a rivet set. Set that in. And I think I'll still go in with the hammer a little bit. That's my rivet head for the 3/16 rivet. I want to kind of even it out. I can put that in there and hit this one a little bit. Just to make it look a little bit more like the other side. Right. Now, I set that first one before drilling the hole for the 1/4 inch one at the bottom because the ears get pulled in by the first rivet. So this is now nice and tight and the hole will drill much easier. I drill from both sides. This 1/4 inch rivet, which I have, is too long. For 1/4 inch, I only want about 5/16 of an inch to stick out. So I have to trim this down to 5/16. That's a pretty straightforward thing to do. I can wrap the handle. Look at where 5/16 is. Right. It's right there. Also being careful not to run my hand up on the head, because even though that's not been sharpened yet, it's still a corner.
taken that off, and I'm going to take a file and take a file and actually level out, because to set a rivet you want that part to be as level as you can make it, because otherwise the rivet might bend rather than upset. So making sure your rivet is square on the end as well as being smooth is a help. Now this rivet set really isn't the right size for that, but it's the closest one I've got. Yep, I'm going to put that one. In place. I'm going to use my little ball peen hammer again. Make sure this thing is as straight as I can get it. And again, I'm just kind of tapping it, because you don't want to just wail on a rivet like that. You're more likely to bend it than to actually set it the way you want, or drive it through the hole. I'm just upsetting it, checking it for alignment every now and then. And of course, my rivet set is sinking in the vise. This never happens to Julia Childs. Her turkeys always come out of the oven perfect. And again, I want to see if I've got a particular direction for the rivet. You can angle the hammer to help correct. If you strike in the center of the rivet, it tends to upset straight down. If you've got a direction to it, you can correct by hitting at an angle. Alright, that's coming along. I'm going to start using the peen. Fudge for the camera here. Okay, that's not too bad. I'll check it for symmetry here and correct minor imbalances.
You want the rivet to be tight up against the metal. But you also want it to be pretty. All I'm working on right now is symmetry, making it even all the way around. The same thing with this one now. Okay. So that's pretty well set. You can see how it's drawn in and tight to the handle. There are little non-conformities here which I can tap down on the anvil to get the ears, because I had done a sort of hollow spoon shape to this using a mandrel that's pretty much the same taper and shape as the wooden handles. And that's one of the handy tools, is to have a mandrel that actually has the same tapers as you're going to turn your handles to. That way you can make the metal parts conform. So the taper on that mandrel is the same taper as the wooden handle. So when I put that mandrel in the socket of the axe and work the ears down, it ends up having the right shape to fit the wooden handle. Alright, I'm going to change the camera and then work these down, and then I'll smooth out the rivet heads a little bit. Going along, I'm now going to take this little edge down to make it tighter to the wood. Okay, so now you can see how that conforms to the handle and is a nice tight edge all the way around.